Hi grade 5s, welcome to our next recorded math lesson. Today's title is Using Decimals and Fractions. Our learning intentions and success criteria are: I am learning to develop number sense so that I can demonstrate an understanding of fractions. I'll know I have it when I can represent and write amounts as equivalent decimals and equivalent fractions. So first off, we've talked about fractions a lot, but we haven't talked that much about decimals. A fraction, as you know, is a numerical quantity that shows part of a whole or part of a set. Now, a decimal is a numerical quantity that shows a part of a whole or a part of a set, but on a scale of tens. So that means that any fraction that's represented over a 10, 100, 1,000, etc. can be written out as a decimal. All right, so you guys have seen one of these before. This is a thousandths grid. So if you think about this as a piece that is divided into 1,000 pieces, meaning that the denominator would be 1,000, if we color in 100 of those, so each one of these little squares is 10, so we want to color in a whole bar. Excuse my scribbles. Okay, so if we colored in a whole bar like that, we would have colored in 100 little rectangles, which means we've colored in 100 out of 1,000 rectangles. And if you remember from our decimals unit, this as a decimal would look like 100 thousandths, just like that. And the interesting thing is we actually say the fraction and the decimal the same way. So this fraction would be said as 100 thousandths, and our decimal is set as 100 thousandths. Okay, we can also do it over hundredths, so same idea. This square has 100 little squares in it. We're going to color in 10 out of the 100 of them. So I'm going to color in this whole little block here with my scribble again, just like that. I've colored in 10 out of 100, so it's 10 hundredths, and my fraction also looks like 10 hundredths. Okay, we can do the same thing with tens. I'm going to color in 1 out of my 10 squares. There's 1. So we say it as 1/10. As a decimal, it's still said as 1/10. Okay, if you're stuck on remembering place values like tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, we don't use these ones in grade 5, or even ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, or millions, I have added a decimal place value chart to the Google Classroom if you need to use it. Okay, so we're going to write the following fractions as decimal thousandths. I'm going to explain this kind of terminology a little bit later, but basically for now it just means that we need to have 3 place values after each of our decimal. So for the first one right here, 345 over 1,000, we know that we need to have 3 place values after our decimal. So I'm going to put a little decimal right there with a 0 in front of it. And because I sometimes get confused, I'm going to put 3 lines there because that will help me remember I need to have 3 numbers written there. Unfortunately, I have 3 numbers right here, so I know I just fill in 345. So it becomes 0.345. Same idea for this one right here. I have 456 over 1,000. I know I need to have 3 place values after the decimal. And look at that, I already have 3 numbers, 3 numerals to write in there. Okay, this one is over 100 only, but I'm supposed to write it as a decimal thousandth, so I need to have 3 places after it still. But if I were to only have 2 places, I would write 23. So I just have to fill in a 0 there. Same with this one. We've got 2 over 10, but I know I need to have 1, 2, 3 places. So I'm going to write my 2 here, and I'll just fill in the rest of the zeros. Okay, this is another interesting one. It's out of 1,000 this time, so that's good. We know we've got our 3 places. But then we've only got a 3 there, so I'm not quite sure where I should put this, but I'm thinking about it and I realized that the 3 actually has to go right here, because if I were to put the 3 right here, that would be 300 thousandths, and that's not what we want. We want 3 thousandths. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of those with zeros. All right, so now we want to write these decimals as fractions. So this is a pretty simple one again as well. With 0.213, we've got 3 place values after the decimal, so we know that it has to be over 1,000. Our denominator is 1,000, and our numerator, very simply, is just 231. Okay, this one, again, there's three places after the decimal, so we know we need to have 1,000 as the denominator, and our numerator is just going to be 7. This one right here, we need 1,000 as the denominator, again, because there's three places after the decimal, and our number on top is just going to be 43. This one here, we only need to have 100 as the denominator because there's only, we only see it to the 100th, and so that's going to be 75 over 100. And lastly, we only need to have 10 on the bottom because our number is in the 10th place. We're going to put 5 on top. Now, an interesting thing about these two fractions here is we can actually reduce them to lowest terms. I happen to know that 75 divided by 25 is 3, and 100 divided by 25, because what you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top, and vice versa. 100 divided by 25 is 4. So in lowest common terms, this fraction is actually 3 over 4, or 3/4. Same with 5 over 10. I know I can divide both of these numbers by 5, meaning that 5 divided by 5 is 1, and 10 divided by 5 is 2, meaning that this decimal is equivalent to 1/2. Okay, so some vocabulary that I said I would talk about a little bit later. If you're asked to write a fraction into decimal thousandths, you should always have 3 place values after the decimal. So decimal thousandths would always look like this. 3 tenths in decimal thousandths would look like this. Okay, so how many place values do you think you would need if you're asked to write a fraction in decimal tenths or decimal hundredths? Okay, take a minute to think about that, and if you need to pause the video to think, that's totally fine. Okay, so if you are asked to write a fraction in decimal tenths, you only need 1 place value after it. In decimal hundredths, you would only need 2 place values after it. Okay. How about if you're asked to write a fraction in tenths, hundredths, or thousandths? What should your denominator be then? So if your fraction, or if your decimal is in tenths, then your fraction denominator should be a 10. If it's in hundreds, your fraction denominator should be 100. And if it's in thousands, your fraction denominator should be 1,000. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense to you guys. Call me if you need to on Zoom. Your worksheet is using decimals and fractions. It's on Google Classroom, and it is due tomorrow.